Come closer. You've been feeling it too, haven't you? That subtle shift, that uneasy feeling that something isn't quite right, that the world you thought you knew is changing. We all rely on frames, don't we, to hold things in place, to define what's inside and what's out. But what if the frame itself became the monster? What if it started to eat what it was meant to protect? If you want to understand the true horror of what's coming, join us in the shadows. Like this video, subscribe, and never miss a nightmare. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's already begun. Our story starts with Elias Thorne, a man who understood frames better than anyone. Elias was a conservator, a restorer of frames. His workshop was a quiet temple of wood, gold leaf, and glass. Every frame told a story, held a memory. For Elias, they were more than just borders, they were guardians. He spent his days mending, preserving, making sure every line was perfect. He was meticulous, almost obsessive. A past incident, a family heirloom painting, had taught him the harsh lesson of neglect. The frame, old and brittle, had failed, letting dampness creep in, ruining the delicate canvas. The painting, a portrait of his lost sister, was gone forever. That loss, that irreparable damage, left a deep scar. It fueled his obsession to protect the contents, to maintain the clear, ordered separation between worlds. He believed frames were sacred, holding reality in place. But reality has a cruel way of twisting our beliefs. Today, Elias was working on an antique mirror. It was old, its silvering slightly faded, its wooden frame carved with intricate, swirling patterns. He carefully cleaned the glass, his breath fogging the surface for a moment. He saw his own reflection, masked and tired. As he polished, he thought he saw something. A flicker deep within the glass, not his reflection, not the workshop, something else. A strange, impassable angle in the background, a shadow that didn't belong. He blinked, and it was gone. He rubbed his eyes. Long hours, poor sleep. It must be fatigue playing tricks on his vision. He dismissed it, turning back to the delicate work of repairing a tiny chip in the mirror's ancient frame. The wood was dry, thirsty for his care. On his desk, a framed photograph sat beside a stack of old blueprints. It was of his sister, her smile bright, frozen in time, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He glanced at it, a familiar ache in his chest, but something felt wrong. The edges of the photo, usually crisp and clear, seemed to blur, to swim a little. Her face, usually so vivid, seemed to subtly disfigure around the frame's inner border. He leaned closer, squinting. Was it just the glass, the aging paper? He picked up the frame, turning it over in his hands. Nothing seemed amiss. The frame was solid, the glass clean. He shook his head, blaming the dim light, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam from the window. He set it back down, trying to forget it. He returned to the antique mirror, his mind still buzzing with the fleeting image and the strange photograph. He focused on the task, sanding a rough patch on the frame, trying to ground himself in the familiar rhythm of his work. Then it happened again. In the mirror's reflection, not just a flicker, but a distinct, impassable distortion. The corner of his workshop, reflected in the glass, seemed to fold in on itself, creating an angle that defied physics. It was sharp, definite. He spun around, looking at the actual corner of the room. It was perfectly normal, straight, solid. He looked back at the mirror. The distortion was gone, just his masked reflection, the familiar workshop behind him. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A faint sound reached his ears. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching, like something tiny scuttling behind wood. It seemed to come from the wall, from one of the many framed prints hanging there. He froze, straining to hear. Silence, only the hum of the old fluorescent light. He told himself it was the house settling, the old wood creaking. But the sound had been too specific, too deliberate. He walked to the wall, his gaze sweeping over the framed etchings. His trauma, the ruined painting, had made him hypersensitive to frames, to their integrity. He saw them as fragile barriers, protecting what was precious from the chaos beyond. He ran his hand over a wooden frame, feeling its smooth, worn surface. The memory of his sister's portrait, warped and stained, flashed in his mind. The once vibrant colors, now a muddy, unrecognizable mess. It wasn't just a painting, it was the last true image of her, corrupted by a frame's failure, a boundary breached. That day he vowed to protect every frame, to keep every content safe. He saw himself as a sentinel against decay, a guardian of order. But what if the decay came from within the guardian itself? What if the frame was the threat? He shook his head, trying to clear the dark thoughts. This was ridiculous. He was tired, stressed. He needed a break. He glanced at the photograph of his sister again, needing that familiar comfort. But the comfort was gone. The blurring was worse, more pronounced. Her smile, once so bright, now seemed to stretch, to warp at the edges, almost as if the frame was tugging at it, pulling her face out of shape. A silent scream forming around her mouth. He snatched the photo from the desk, his heart pounding. He held it up to the light, inspecting it with trembling hands. The image was definitely distorted, not just blurring, but a subtle, impassable disfigurement, a ripple in reality. He traced the inner edge of the frame with his finger. It felt strangely warm, almost pulsing, a faint vibration like a tiny heart beating. He quickly pulled his hand back, a gasp trapped in his throat. This wasn't just old paper or bad light. The scratching returned, louder this time, not from one frame, but from several. A chorus of tiny, dry scrapes, whispers from within the wood. It sounded like something was trying to escape, or perhaps trying to get asterisk in asterisk. His eyes darted around the workshop. Every framed object seemed to hum with a low, barely audible vibration. A landscape painting on the far wall caught his attention. He stared. The trees within the frame were subtly different. A branch, a gnarled limb, had shifted or grown. It now extended in an impassable curve, defying the original composition, defying nature. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes. When he looked again, it was back to normal, a trick of the mind, he hoped. But the feeling of dread persisted, growing stronger, colder. The air in the workshop felt heavy, thick with unseen presence. He turned back to the antique mirror, drawn by an awful magnetic pull. He had to know, he had to see. He stood before it, his own masked reflection staring back. He watched, breath held tight in his chest, and then it began again. Slowly, subtly, the reflection of his workshop started to warp, to twist, to unravel. The familiar lines of his workbench, the tools, the stacked frames, all began to bend. Not a gentle curve, but sharp, impassable angles. A corner of the room in the reflection folded inward, creating a void, a dark, impassable space. He reached out, his gloved hand moving towards the glass. His reflection mirrored the movement, but the impassable void remained, deep and unsettling. It was there, undeniable, a geometric impossibility within his own workshop. His mind reeled. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. The frame of the mirror, meant to contain, was now actively showing him something that should not be. A window into what? The impossible space within the reflection seemed to deepen, to draw him in. He felt a cold, oppressive weight, as if the air itself was being compressed. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He was transfixed by the horror. Then a subtle movement within the impossible space. A shimmer, a ripple. Something was forming there, deep within the distorted reflection. Something not of his world. Something alien, taking shape in the void. It was slow, agonizingly slow, like a birth or an emergence. A shape not quite solid, not quite liquid, twisting and turning in the impossible angles of the reflected room. It seemed to pulse, a dark, living thing. A low hum filled the workshop, vibrating through the floor, through his bones. It wasn't sound, it was a feeling. A deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the mirror itself, from its very frame. The frame, the beautiful, intricate frame he had been restoring. It was no longer just wood and gold. It was a gateway, a boundary that was not protecting but consuming, a border that was not containing but inviting. The alien form in the reflection grew clearer, more defined. It was a tangle of impossible limbs, of shifting surfaces, of eyes that were not eyes, staring out from the void. It was reaching, stretching towards him. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. He wanted to run, but his feet were rooted to the floor. The entity in the mirror was almost fully formed, its presence radiating pure, inescapable horror, and it was framed. The mirror's frame itself seemed to pulse with a dark, hungry light. The intricate carvings twisted, becoming grotesque faces, silently screaming. The boundary was thinning, breaking. The line between art and horrifying reality was gone. Elias Thorne, the guardian of frames, stared into the abyss. The very thing he cherished, the very thing he sought to preserve, was now devouring everything. And he was trapped, watching his world unspool, reframed by pure, inescapable horror. The first cracks had appeared, and the world would never be the same. The memory of the mirror burned in Elias's mind. The impossible angles, the alien form, the frame's hungry pulse. It wasn't a trick of the light, not a tired hallucination. It was real. He had seen it, felt it. But how could it be? How could a frame, a simple boundary, become something so monstrous? He backed away slowly from the antique mirror, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to stretch. Every creak of the old house sounded like a whisper. He felt a profound chill, not from the cold, but from the realization that his sanctuary, his ordered world, had been utterly invaded. The frames he cherished were turning against him. He spent the rest of that night in a daze, huddled in his armchair, the workshop lights blazing. He kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see the impossible entity again. It remained still, reflecting only his own terrified, masked face and the familiar room, but he knew. The illusion of safety was shattered. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares of twisting frames and consuming voids plagued him. He saw his sister's face, her smile stretching, dissolving into a dark, hungry maw. He woke in a cold sweat, the images still vivid, the dread a physical weight in his chest. His sanity felt like a fragile pane of glass, cracking under an unseen pressure. He tried to tell himself it was stress, exhaustion, a breakdown. The mind plays tricks, doesn't it? especially when you're alone, obsessed with delicate boundaries. But the memory of the pulsing frame, the alien form, was too real, too sharp to dismiss. He knew deep down that something truly awful had begun. For days, he retreated further into his reclusion. He stopped taking calls, ignored the world outside. The workshop, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage, every framed object a potential gateway to horror. He moved with a new, careful slowness, as if disturbing any frame might unleash something terrible. The mirror, now covered with a heavy cloth, still radiated a cold presence. He couldn't bring himself to uncover it, to face what might lurk within its depths. What would you do if your own reflection promised only madness, if the very act of looking could unravel your world? His meticulous nature, once a source of comfort, now fed his paranoia. He began to check every frame, every pane of glass, every doorway in his house, looking for cracks, for subtle shifts, for any sign of the impossible. His fingers traced the borders, searching for the first hint of corruption. One afternoon, staring out his living room window, he saw it. Not a distortion in the glass, but a distortion asterisk through asterisk the glass. The familiar street, the neighbor's house, seemed to ripple, to shift. For a fleeting second, the street was gone, replaced by a landscape of impossible, jagged spires under a bruised, alien sky. Then just as quickly it snapped back. The ordinary street, the everyday world. He blinked, rubbed his eyes. Was it a trick of the light again? A reflection? But the memory of those impossible spires, that bruised sky, felt too real, too vivid to be dismissed. The frames were not just distorting, they were replacing. The phenomenon began to spread. The small window in his kitchen, usually showing his overgrown garden, sometimes flickered. A glimpse of something vast and empty, a void filled with shimmering, geometric patterns. He'd drop whatever he was holding, his breath catching in his throat, only for the normal view to return. Even the doorways, walking from one room to another, there were moments. A split second when the space beyond the frame wasn't his hallway, wasn't his bedroom. It was a dizzying, impassable tunnel of unknown colors, or a sudden, suffocating darkness. He'd stumble, catching himself on the doorframe, his mind reeling. What would you do if your home, the place you felt safest, suddenly became a series of unstable gateways? If every doorway was a gamble, every window a peek into madness? The world was unspooling, reframing itself with horrifying new realities, and Elias was trapped within its shifting borders. He started to document everything. Notebooks filled with hurried sketches of the impossible landscapes, careful notes on the exact times and locations of the shifts. He believed if he could understand the pattern, he could fight it. He could restore order. It was his obsession, his desperate hope. But even his documentation was not safe. He'd return to his notes, only to find the precise details of a geometric pattern subtly altered. A spire sketched as sharp now appeared curved. A color noted as blue was now a sickly green. The evidence itself was shifting, blurring, mirroring the chaos outside. He tried taking photographs with his old Polaroid camera, hoping for tangible proof. But the developed images were always normal. The alien landscapes, the impossible voids, vanished from the film, leaving behind only the mundane reality he desperately wanted to believe was true. The frames were actively erasing their transgressions. This constant thwarting deepened his paranoia. Was he truly seeing these things, or was his mind finally breaking, constructing these horrors to punish him for his past failure, for the ruined portrait? He paced his workshop, a prisoner in his own home, questioning every sight, every sound, every memory. The lines between what was real and what was illusion blurred into a terrifying haze. He felt like a character in a painting, trapped within a frame that was slowly, subtly, changing its own contents. His world, once so meticulously ordered, was becoming a metaphysical collage, each piece unstable, each border permeable. He found himself staring at his sister's photograph again, the small, framed image on his desk. He remembered the first subtle blurring, the silent scream around her mouth. Now it was worse. The distortion was undeniable, a slow, creeping corruption of her features. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, seemed to sink deeper into the paper, becoming hollow. Her smile, once warm, now stretched into something unnatural, a grotesque rictus that pulled at the edges of the frame. It was as if the frame was actively devouring her image, twisting it into something alien and terrifying. He tried to remove the photograph from its frame, desperate to save the last true image of her. But his fingers fumbled, the glass felt strangely resistant, almost sticky. He pulled, he tugged, but the photograph seemed fused to the frame, an inseparable, horrifying whole. The boundary had become the predator. A low hum filled the room, a familiar vibration that emanated from the frame in his hands. It was the same pulse he had felt from the antique mirror, a dark, hungry energy. The photograph was not just distorted, it was being consumed, transformed into a new, monstrous reality by the very frame meant to protect it. He dropped the frame, a choked cry escaping his masked mouth. It clattered to the floor, but the hum persisted, a low thrumming that seemed to fill the entire workshop. Every frame, every window, every doorway seemed to resonate with that same dreadful vibration. The house itself was alive, and it was hungry. The world outside his reclusive existence felt like a distant, fragile dream. He rarely ventured out, but when he did, the shifts followed him. Storefront windows would briefly show impossible displays, reflections would flicker with alien entities. He started to see every boundary, every edge, as a potential threat. His mind, once so sharp and logical, was fraying. The constant uncertainty, the blurring of reality, the inescapable dread was taking its toll. He was losing control, not just of his surroundings, but of his own perceptions. He was becoming as fragmented as the world he now inhabited. He began to perceive the world itself as a series of unstable frames. The sky framed by trees, the distant mountains framed by the horizon, even the very air framed by the walls of his room. And each frame, he knew, was a lie, a thin boundary waiting to be breached, waiting to consume. One evening, as dusk settled, a delivery driver approached his door. Elias rarely ordered anything, but this was a package he couldn't recall. He watched through the peephole, a sliver of the outside world framed by the small, circular lens. The driver, a young man with a friendly wave, stood on his porch. Elias hesitated. Every interaction, every opening felt like a risk, but he needed to sign for the package. He slowly unlatched the heavy door, opening it just enough to reveal the driver, framed perfectly by the doorway. A normal, everyday sight. As the driver reached out with the package, something happened. Not a flicker, not a blur, a sudden, complete shift. The driver standing there a second ago was gone, vanished. The space within the doorway where he had been was empty. In his place, a silhouette, not a human shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs twisted into grotesque angles like a broken insect. It seemed to pulse with an inner darkness, filling the doorway, its presence radiating pure, ancient malevolence. It was the framing entity staring back. Elias could not breathe. He could not move. The thing in the doorway was not a reflection, not a trick. It was there, solid and terrifying, framed perfectly by his own front door. It was reaching, stretching, its non-existent face seeming to lean closer. A cold, soundless scream tore through his mind. This was it, the ultimate breach. The frames were not just distorting images, they were consuming reality, replacing it with the impossible, the monstrous. His desperate need to preserve boundaries had led him to this, to face the very horror he sought to contain. The silhouette seemed to solidify, its edges sharpening. Elias felt a profound, chilling sense of recognition. This was the same presence he had felt from the mirror, the same hunger. It had found him. It had come for him through his own front door. He wanted to slam the door shut, to run, to hide, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed, caught in the terrifying gaze of the framing entity. It was a predator, and he was its prey, framed by the very entrance to his home. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The grotesque silhouette dissolved like smoke in a strong wind, and the delivery driver was back, standing there, package in hand, a confused look on his face. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his voice normal, everyday. Elias stared at the man, his mind reeling. Had it been real? Had he imagined the impossible horror? He looked around at the familiar porch, the ordinary street. It was all normal, but the memory of the silhouette, its impossible form, was seared into his mind. "Yes, fine," Elias croaked, his voice strained. He snatched the package, his hands trembling, and slammed the door shut, locking it with every bolt. He pressed his back against the solid wood, gasping for breath, his heart hammering. He slid down to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. It was not his imagination. This was not a breakdown. The frames were truly malevolent. They were not just corrupting his perception, they were actively consuming and replacing, bringing horrors from other dimensions into his world. The delivery driver had been replaced. For a moment, he had been gone, his reality devoured by the hungry frame of the doorway. Elias was certain now. The frames were gateways, and something ancient and terrible was using them to slowly, systematically, unspool his world. What would you do when the very structures meant to define your reality become the instruments of its destruction? Elias Thorne, the conservator of frames, knew his meticulous efforts were useless. The boundaries were breaking, and the next time a frame shifted, what impossible horror would step through? The memory of the doorway, the impossible silhouette, was seared into Elias's mind. He was still pressed against the front door, gasping for air, the wood cold against his back. It wasn't just a flicker now. The frames were actively consuming, replacing reality. His world had not merely cracked, it was being devoured, piece by terrifying piece. He crawled away from the door, his limbs heavy, his mind reeling. The house, once his refuge, now felt like a predator. Every framed picture, every window, every doorway seemed to hum with a low, malevolent energy. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unseen presences, waiting. He knew he couldn't stay here, not truly. But where could he go? The horror wasn't outside. It was in the very fabric of existence, in the boundaries that defined his world. He was trapped, an unwilling observer to the unraveling of reality, a prisoner in a house that was now a collection of shifting gateways. Days bled into nights. Elias stopped eating, barely sleeping. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach. He watched the frames, always watching. He saw the landscape painting in his hall flicker, briefly showing a barren, red desert under a sky of swirling, dark clouds, before snapping back to a peaceful meadow. The kitchen window, which usually looked out onto his small, overgrown garden, now showed glimpses of impossible geometries. A lattice of glowing, alien structures, constantly shifting and reconfiguring. He would freeze, his breath held, waiting for the normal view to return, always with a fresh wave of nausea. The framing entity was growing bolder, more aggressive. It wasn't just brief flashes now. The shifts lasted longer, the replacement realities more vivid, more terrifying. It was like a hungry mouth, slowly chewing through the fabric of his home, digesting and replacing the familiar with the alien. One morning he found the framed certificate on his wall, a testament to his restoration skills, completely changed. The elegant script, his name, his achievements, were replaced by a swirling, illegible pattern of symbols that seemed to writhe on the paper. The frame pulsed with a faint, green light. He reached out, his hand shaking, to touch the frame. It was warm, almost hot to the touch. The symbols inside seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to break free or perhaps to pull him in. What would you do if your own accomplishments became a gateway to something monstrous? This was too much. He couldn't just watch his world dissolve. He had to fight back. He grabbed a heavy mallet from his workbench. He would destroy it. He would break the frame, shatter the glass, and stop the consumption. He had to try. He raised the mallet, aiming for the glowing, pulsing frame of the certificate. He swung with all his might, a desperate cry escaping his throat, but the mallet didn't connect. It seemed to pass through the frame, meeting no resistance. His swing carried him forward, stumbling into the wall. He looked back, panting, eyes wide with disbelief. The frame was untouched. The green glow pulsed brighter, and the symbols inside seemed to mock him, twisting into new, more complex patterns. And then a cold mist began to seep from the frame, not just from the symbols, but from the wood itself. It spread, tendrils of impossible fog curling into his workshop, bringing with it a smell like ozone and something ancient, something that didn't belong on Earth. The anomaly was bleeding into his physical space. He stumbled back, coughing, the strange mist burning his lungs. It was cold, yet it felt alive, sentient. It swirled around his feet, licking at his ankles, threatening to envelop him. The frame wasn't just a gateway, it was an open wound, oozing horror into his reality. He fled, scrambling into his living room, slamming the door shut behind him. The mist, however, seeped under the door, a thin, creeping line of purple. He pressed his back against the door, watching it, terrified. He couldn't destroy them. He couldn't contain them. They were everywhere. Desperate, Elias thought of his old colleague, Dr. Alastair Finch. Alastair was a skeptic, a man of science, but he was also brilliant. Perhaps he could explain it, rationalize it, help him. It was a long shot, but Elias was out of options. He needed someone, anyone, to believe him. He called Alastair, his voice hoarse, trembling. He tried to explain the impossible shifts, the consuming frames, the alien entities. Alastair listened patiently, his voice calm, but Elias could hear the doubt, the concern for his mental state in every word. Elias begged Alastair to come over to see the evidence. He described the glowing certificate, the mist. Alastair agreed, reluctantly, promising to visit the next day. Elias felt a flicker of hope, a desperate spark in the overwhelming darkness. Someone might finally believe him. He spent the night gathering proof. He took photos with his phone, recorded videos of the shifting window. He even tried to capture the lingering mist from the workshop. He felt a surge of purpose, a desperate need to show someone, to prove he wasn't mad. When Alastair arrived, Elias led him through the house, pointing out the frames, explaining the horrors. But the landscape painting was a normal meadow. The kitchen window showed only the garden. The certificate on the wall was perfectly normal, its elegant script intact. No glow, no mist, no alien symbols. Alastair looked at Elias with pity, concern etching his face. He gently suggested stress, fatigue, perhaps a need for rest. Elias showed him the photos and videos on his phone. They were all normal, mundane. The horrors had vanished, leaving only a bewildered, desperate man. Alastair left, promising to call, but Elias knew he was alone. The frames had hidden their crimes, actively erasing the evidence, further isolating him. The silence in the house, after Alastair's departure, felt heavier, more mocking. The entity was playing with him. He slumped into his armchair, his gaze falling on the framed photograph of his sister, the one he had tried to save, the one that had felt fused to its frame. He remembered the old trauma, the priceless family heirloom painting, believed to contain the last true image of her, ruined by a neglected frame. He had always blamed the neglect, the dampness, the brittle wood. But now, a horrifying thought twisted in his mind. What if it wasn't neglect? What if the frame had been eating her image even then? What if this horror had begun long ago with his deepest, most painful loss? He picked up the photograph of his sister again. The distortion was undeniable now. Her face, once so clear, was a swirling vortex of stretched features, her smile a grotesque pull towards the dark, hungry edges of the frame. It was a silent, agonizing consumption. The frame pulsed in his hands, a low, steady thrumming. He remembered the feeling from the antique mirror, from the certificate. It was the framing entity, feeding, growing, twisting his past trauma into a new, unbearable horror. The boundary had always been the monster. His mind, once so ordered, so meticulous, was now a fractured mess. The world was a collage of impossible realities, and he was losing his grip. He saw frames everywhere, in everything. The window of his eye, the frame of his vision, the very air framed by his body, and each one was a potential threat. He started to avoid looking directly at anything, keeping his gaze unfocused, hoping to ward off the shifts. But the entity was insidious. It didn't need him to look. It was everywhere, in every boundary, waiting for its moment. The sounds were worse now too, not just scratching, but whispers. Faint, echoing voices from within the walls, from behind the frames. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, yet he felt their meaning: hunger, consumption, chaos. He felt like a ghost in his own home, a fleeting image in a frame that was constantly changing around him. He was a content, waiting to be consumed, waiting to be replaced by something alien and terrible. The terror of false containment was his new reality. One day he found himself in the bathroom, staring at a normal mirror, not the antique one from his workshop, but a simple, everyday mirror above the sink. He hadn't looked at his own reflection clearly in days, weeks perhaps. He needed to see himself, to prove he was still there. He leaned closer, peering into the glass. His eyes, tired and haunted, stared back. The mask covered his mouth, but his gaze held a desperate plea. He was still Elias. He was still here. The world was falling apart, but he was still himself. Then it began, slowly, subtly, from the very edges of his reflection. A faint ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. It started at the frame of the mirror, creeping inward towards his reflected image. The distortion spread, a dark, hungry stain. His hair, his shoulders, the very shape of his head began to stretch, to warp, pulled inwards by the unseen force of the frame. He watched, horrified, as his own reflection began to be consumed. A cold dread gripped him. This wasn't just his surroundings. This was him. His own image, his own identity was being devoured by the malevolent frame. The entity had found a new, more intimate way to attack, to erase him. The edges of his reflection twisted into impassable angles, sharp and jagged, like broken glass. The dark stains spread to his visible eyes, pulling at them, stretching them wide, making them seem hollow, alien. He was losing himself. A low hum filled the small bathroom, vibrating from the mirror itself. It was the hungry pulse, the familiar thrumming of the framing entity. It was actively feeding on his reflection, on his very self, contained within the boundary of the mirror. He wanted to scream, to tear himself away, but he was frozen, mesmerized by the horrifying transformation. His identity, his essence, was being peeled away, replaced by something else, something monstrous, something from the impassable voids. The reflection was no longer him. It was a tangle of impassable limbs, of shifting surfaces, of eyes that were not eyes, staring out from the void that had once been his face. It was the framing entity, fully manifested, staring back at him from his own mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. It was a window, a gateway into his very soul, and the entity had stepped through. It pulsed, a dark, malevolent heart beating within the glass. Elias stared into the impassable form, knowing he was truly lost. The last thing he saw, before the impassable form in the mirror seemed to reach out, was the faint, dark glow of its eyes, not eyes, but swirling points of pure existential dread. He had sought to preserve boundaries, but now he was becoming the boundary and the content of an inescapable, reframed horror. The impassable form in the mirror had reached for Elias. His heart hammered, his breath caught. He was frozen, staring at the alien entity that had worn his face. It was no longer a reflection. It was a hungry maw, open and waiting. Then, with a sickening lurch, the image snapped back. His own masked face stared out from the mirror, tired and haunted. The bathroom was normal, the light harsh, but the memory, the terror, was seared into his mind. It had been real, and it had been looking for him. He backed away, stumbling, the taste of ash in his mouth. The entity was not just consuming his home, it was consuming him. His very image, his identity, was a boundary it could breach. He was not just an observer, he was a target, the ultimate content. The house around him began to change faster, more aggressively. The shifts were no longer fleeting glimpses. They were prolonged, vivid assaults. Every frame, every opening was a wound bleeding chaos into his world. His sanctuary was becoming a patchwork of impassable realities. His living room window, a familiar view of his quiet street, now showed a vast, desolate landscape of crimson sand dunes under a sky of swirling, black clouds. It lasted for minutes, not seconds. A silent, alien world framed perfectly where his garden should be. He stumbled through his home, desperate for a stable point, a place where reality held firm. But there was none. A doorway to his kitchen now opened onto a dizzying, vertical cityscape of metallic spires. The framed family photos on his mantelpiece flickered with impassible faces. His own framed artwork, pieces he had restored with such care, were now canvases of horror. A serene landscape painting had morphed into a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, its serene green hills replaced by pulsating, organic matter. The frames were not just holding images, they were creating nightmares. He stared at one such painting, his mind trying to make sense of the impossible. The delicate gold leaf on the frame seemed to undulate, to breathe. It was then the horrifying truth struck him. His meticulous preservation, his obsession with boundaries, had been fueling this all along. The entity fed on the principle of containment itself. Every frame he had perfected, every boundary he had strengthened, had become a more potent meal, a more powerful gateway. His life's work, his desperate need for order, was the very engine of chaos. What would you do if your deepest purpose, your life's meaning, was revealed to be the source of all your terror? Elias felt a profound, crushing despair. He had not been protecting, he had been cultivating the monster. The memory of his sister's ruined portrait, the neglected frame, twisted in his mind. It wasn't neglect. It had been the entity, even then, subtly consuming, preparing. His past trauma, the very root of his obsession, was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion by the monster. Then the whispers started again. Not just scratching, but low, guttural sounds, like dry leaves skittering across stone, yet forming words in his mind. They seemed to emanate from the very wood of the walls, from behind the glass of the windows. It hungers for order. The whispers slithered into his thoughts, cold and venomous. It desires chaos. They were not just sounds, they were a direct mental assault, invading his most private space. He clutched his head, trying to block them out. It lives where things belong. The words echoed, mocking him. He had spent his life defining where things belong, meticulously placing boundaries. And now, that very obsession was being turned against him, becoming the entity's weapon. He couldn't stand the confines of the house any longer. He had to escape, even if just for a moment, to see if the outside world still held some semblance of sanity. He pulled on a coat, his hands trembling, and forced himself out the front door. The familiar street lay before him, but it was wrong, horribly wrong. The air itself seemed to shimmer like heat haze, but colder, more sinister. The world outside his house was no longer a reprieve. It was a larger, more terrifying canvas for the entity. Distant buildings flickered, their solid structures momentarily replaced by impassable, crystalline towers that scraped against a bruised, purple sky. Then they would snap back, mundane and ordinary, leaving Elias gasping, questioning his own eyes. The sky itself, framed by the rooftops, was no longer a consistent blue. It pulsed with impassable colors, glimpses of swirling nebulae and alien constellations. The clouds shifted into geometric patterns, then dissolved, only to reform into something utterly unnatural. The world was a collage. He saw a distant billboard, its advertisement for a local diner replaced by a shifting, impassable landscape of jagged obsidian peaks. The border of the billboard, its simple frame, held a window into pure, unadulterated horror. Everywhere he looked, the frames were failing. Panic seized him. There was no escape. The horror was not confined to his home. It was the world itself, unraveling. He ran back inside, slamming the door, seeking the illusion of safety, even though he knew it was a lie. The whispers followed him. The whispers intensified, filling his ears, his mind. They were no longer just words. They were a cacophony of alien sounds, twisting into impossible syntax. He understood them somehow without truly hearing. They spoke of consumption, of boundaries, of his own impending doom. It hungers for order, it desires chaos. The words were like sharp needles in his brain. He was the epitome of order, a conservator of boundaries. He was the perfect prey, the ultimate meal for an entity that fed on containment. It lives where things belong, and you, Elias, you belong to us now. The final whisper chilled him to the bone. They knew his name. They were inside his head, inside his very being. The conceptual invasion was complete. His mind was a fractured mess, his thoughts a frantic scramble of fear and paranoia. He saw frames everywhere, in every line, every edge. His own vision, framed by his eyes, felt unstable, threatening to shatter at any moment. He stood by a tall, narrow window, staring out at the blurred chaos of his garden. He rested his hand on the glass, his fingers splayed against the cool pane. His own hand, framed by the window's border, a contained content in itself. Then he felt it, a faint tingling, a subtle shift. His fingers, framed by the glass, seemed to ripple, to stretch. The skin on his hand appeared to darken, to thicken. He gasped, pulling his hand back, but it was too late. The transformation accelerated. His fingertips elongated, becoming sharp, almost claw-like. The smooth skin became scaly, iridescent, catching the dim light in an impossible way. The bone structure twisted, reforming into something utterly alien, grotesque. It was no longer his hand. It was an impossible appendage, a limb from another dimension, twisting and writhing within the frame of the window. A part of him, a part of his very body, was being consumed, reframed by the entity. He tore his hand away from the glass with a choked cry of pure terror. He stared at it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The impossible appendage, the alien form, had vanished. His hand was normal again, unchanged, unblemished. But the image was seared into his mind. The feeling of his own flesh twisting, reforming into something monstrous. The entity was not just attacking his surroundings, it was attacking him. He was being framed. His own body was becoming a boundary. What would you do if your own skin became a frame, a border that could be breached, replaced? The horror was no longer external, it was internal. The entity was consuming him from the inside out, turning his very being into a canvas of fear. He looked at his reflection in a small piece of broken glass on his workshop floor. His masked face, his tired eyes stared back, but the edges of his visible eyes seemed to ripple, to blur, like water disturbed by an unseen force. He was unraveling. The world he perceived was no longer just outside him. It was inside, too. His thoughts, his memories, his very sense of self were becoming fragmented, reframed by the entity's insidious touch. He was losing control of his own mind, his own reality. He felt a cold, alien presence within him, a subtle tugging at the edges of his consciousness. Like a part of his soul was being pulled into the vast, multidimensional collage the entity was creating. He was becoming a piece of its horrifying art. The fear was absolute. The entity was not just a threat to his world, but to his very existence. He was no longer just a conservator. He was a content, awaiting consumption, awaiting replacement. He looked at his gloved hand again, turning it over and over, searching for any lingering sign of the transformation. It looked normal, felt normal, but he knew what it had been, what it could be again. The whispers returned, louder, clearer. You are the frame, Elias. You are the content. They were no longer taunting. They were stating a fact, a horrifying truth that resonated deep within his bones. He was the next boundary to be breached. He felt a strange, cold, tingling sensation begin in his feet, slowly creeping up his legs. It wasn't pain, but a chilling numbness, a sense of his own body becoming rigid, defined, like a frame being set, prepared. The walls of his perception closed in, the world narrowing to a single, terrifying point. He was becoming the frame, and the entity was preparing to fill him with its unspeakable contents. His desperate need for order had created the ultimate chaos. Elias Thorne, the last conservator of boundaries, felt the cold embrace of the entity. He was no longer just experiencing the horror, he was becoming it. And as the tingling sensation reached his chest, he knew with chilling certainty that his world, his body, his very soul was about to be reframed by pure, inescapable horror. The cold embrace of the entity still lingered, a phantom chill in Elias's bones. His world, his body, his very soul had been on the brink of being reframed. He was no longer just experiencing the horror, he was becoming it. But in that ultimate terror, a desperate, terrifying clarity had emerged. He had sought to preserve boundaries, to protect the contents, but that was the entity's food. His meticulous care, his obsession had been a feast. He had been so wrong. The only way to fight it, he now understood, was to deny its sustenance, to break the frames, not preserve them. What would you do if your life's work was the enemy's fuel? Elias grabbed a heavy hammer, his hands trembling with a new kind of resolve, not fear. He would smash every frame, tear every canvas. He would dismantle the very concept of containment, peace, by horrifying peace. He approached a framed landscape print, one he had meticulously restored years ago. Its serene hills now seemed to mock him, a perfect boundary for the entity to consume. With a guttural cry, he swung the hammer, aiming for the glass, for the wood, for the very idea of it. The hammer met the frame with a sickening thud, but there was no shattering glass, no splintering wood. The hammer simply bounced off, as if hitting an invisible, rubbery surface. The frame pulsed, a dark, triumphant thrumming. The image within the frame rippled, and the serene hills twisted into jagged, impassable peaks. A chasm opened in the painted sky, revealing a void of swirling, alien colors. The entity was not deterred. It was adapting, marking his futile efforts. He tried again, with more force, more desperation. He tore at a framed photograph of a distant relative, ripping the paper. But the tearing sound was wrong, like fabric ripping from another dimension. The frame itself remained whole, and the torn image reformed, subtly different, more alien. The entity was not just corrupting frames, it was the corruption of the idea of a frame. Any boundary, any edge, any perceived limit was its domain. His attempts to break them only highlighted their existence, drawing its attention, its hunger. A low hum filled the house, not from one frame, but from everywhere. It was the sound of a conceptual predator stretching its awareness, its hunger. Elias was no longer just an observer. He was the prey, now actively hunted within his own home. Fragmented, glitching entities began to emerge. Not fully formed horrors, but suggestions. A hand reaching from a crack in the wall. An eye peering from the space between a door and its jamb. A shifting pattern in the corner of his vision. He would catch a glimpse of a twisted limb in the reflection of a polished tabletop, only for it to vanish when he turned. He saw faces, not human, peering from the edges of his bookshelves, their features shifting, dissolving, reforming. His sanity frayed, stretched thin by the constant assaults. Was he truly seeing these things? Or was his mind finally breaking, constructing these horrors from the depths of his own terror? What was real? What was illusion? He questioned every perception. The solidity of the floor, the warmth of the air, the very sound of his own breath. Was he breathing in air or some alien atmosphere? Was the floor truly beneath his feet, or a shimmering illusion over a void? He was living in the entity's grand, horrifying collage, a patchwork reality where nothing stayed in its place, where every familiar thing was a lie, a temporary placeholder for something monstrous. He was trapped in its art. A terrifying insight struck him, cold and sharp as ice. The entity wasn't just asterisk corrupting asterisk frames. It asterisk was asterisk the corruption of the asterisk idea asterisk of a frame. It was a conceptual predator feeding on the very principle of containment, of order, of separation. It didn't need a physical frame. It needed the asterisk concept asterisk of one. The boundary between light and shadow, between sanity and madness, between life and whatever lay beyond. Elias, the conservator of boundaries, was its ultimate meal. He stumbled through his workshop, the air thick with unseen presences. The whispers were no longer just in his mind. They seemed to emanate from the very air, from the dust motes dancing in the faint light. They spoke of hunger, of the deliciousness of order. His past, his obsession with his sister's portrait, the ruined heirloom, it was all a setup. The entity had been there, subtly influencing, preparing him, cultivating his need for frames, for the perfect meal. He suddenly felt a chilling vibration, not in his hands, but in his chest, in his very core. The low hum intensified, surrounding him. He was no longer just being hunted, he was being cornered. The space around him seemed to shrink, to press in. From every corner, every shadow, every subtle line where wall met floor, they emerged. Not solid, not fully real, but shimmering, glitching forms. Twisted limbs, impassible eyes, mouths that were not mouths, all framed by the edges of his vision. His breath hitched. He was surrounded. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of alien voices that tore through his mind. And then the ultimate terror began. The very edges of his own body started to distort. His fingers, once so meticulous, so precise, began to stretch, to elongate. Not like bone and flesh, but like liquid pulled taut, then snapping back, subtly changed. His skin rippled, shifting colors, becoming iridescent. He watched, horrified, as his forearms seemed to flatten, to widen, its contours sharpening into impossible angles. It was as if he himself was being reframed, his own flesh becoming a border, a container for something alien. The feeling was not pain, but a chilling sense of unmaking, of his own body becoming a canvas, a frame, for the entity's horrifying art. He was being consumed from the inside out, his very essence being replaced. What would you do if your own skin became a boundary, a frame for something monstrous? Elias staggered back, bumping into a workbench, sending tools clattering. The noise was dull, distant, as if from another dimension. His vision flickered. The workshop, his sanctuary, was dissolving around him, replaced by glimpses of impassable landscapes. Jagged spires, swirling voids, alien geometries. His world was becoming a chaotic, multidimensional collage. The fragmented entities pressed closer, their glitching forms swirling around him. They were the architects of this new reality, the artists of his despair. They were drawing him in, making him a part of their masterpiece. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat felt like a frame, rigid and unyielding. His thoughts, once so ordered, were now a frantic, terrifying jumble, each idea a fragmented piece of a broken mirror. The whispers intensified, no longer words, but pure, raw conceptual noise. They spoke of the unmaking, of the joy of boundaries dissolving, of the final, delicious consumption of order. They were celebrating. He felt the entity's presence, not as a physical thing, but as a vast, ancient consciousness. It was everywhere, in every line, every edge, every perceived separation. And it was inside him, too, at the very core of his being. His legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. His arms, too, were stiffening, becoming rigid like old wood. He was becoming a statue, a frame, a permanent fixture in the entity's ever-changing gallery of horrors. He tried to move, to fight, but his body was no longer his own. It was being reshaped, reframed by an unseen, malevolent force. He was losing control, not just of his mind, but of his very physical form. His vision blurred, then sharpened, showing him the world not as it was, but as the entity saw it. A vast, endless canvas of shifting boundaries, of consuming frames, of realities devoured and replaced. He saw himself, reflected in a shard of glass on the floor, not his familiar masked face, but a shifting, fragmented image. His eyes were dissolving, his mouth, hidden by the mask, seemed to stretch into an impossible void. He was becoming a part of the collage, a living, breathing frame for the entity's horrors. His desperate need for order had led him to this, to become the very thing he fought, the very boundary that would consume itself. The cold, tingling sensation returned, creeping higher, reaching his chest, his neck. His head felt heavy, fixed. He was being solidified, becoming a permanent boundary, a final frame. The fragmented entities swirled around him, their forms coalescing, sharpening. They were no longer just glitches. They were solidifying, becoming real, tangible horrors, framed by the edges of his failing vision. They were reaching for him, not with hands, but with tendrils of pure concept, pulling at the edges of his being. He was the ultimate content, the final boundary, and he was about to be breached, consumed, replaced. The last thing he saw, before his vision too became a frame, was the entity itself, not as a single form, but as a vast, all-encompassing presence. It was the space between things, the edge of all existence, and it was devouring him. Elias Thorne, the conservator, the man who cherished frames, felt his final boundary dissolve. His body, his mind, his very soul unspooled into the terrifying collage. And as the world, as he knew it, ceased to be, what new, unspeakable horror would be reframed in its place? Elias stared at the chaos. His meticulous work, his life's purpose had been a meal for the entity. The only way to fight, he realized, was to become formless, to shed every boundary, every frame, even his own sense of self, to become unframed. He closed his eyes, trying to unsee the world, to unthink his thoughts, to dissolve the borders of his own perception. But the whispers, the alien symphony of the entity, were inside him, too. They were framing his very consciousness. He tried to tear at his clothes, to shed the skin that framed his body. But his movements were slow, as if wading through thick, conceptual glue. His skin, his very flesh, felt like a rigid, unyielding frame, holding something terrifying within. The walls of his workshop began to melt, not into liquid, but into pure geometry. Angles shifted, lines bent, creating spaces that defied all reason. His world was not breaking, it was being meticulously reassembled into a nightmare. The floor beneath his feet became a shimmering illusion. He saw glimpses of impassable depths, of swirling nebulae and jagged, crystalline structures far below. Every step was a gamble, every surface a deception. Colors he had never seen, sounds he had never heard, assaulted him. A symphony of discord, a visual cacophony. His senses were overwhelmed, unable to process the constant, jarring shifts. This was the infinite carrelage, and he was trapped within its borders. A doorway in front of him suddenly became a window, then a wall. Then it stretched into an impassably long tunnel, twisting and turning into itself. Spaces folded, inverted, defying every rule of physics he knew. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient. It was the breath of the entity filling his lungs, reframing his very respiration. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant thrumming that was no longer just a sound. It was a pressure, a vibration that resonated in his bones, in his very soul. It was the heartbeat of the consuming boundary. He looked at his hands, and they were not his. They were a carrelage of skin, metal, and light, constantly shifting, reforming. He was seeing the world as the entity saw it, a collection of fragments waiting to be rearranged. Who was Elias? The name felt alien, a label he no longer recognized. His memories flickered, like old photographs being burned, their edges curling, their images dissolving into smoke. Then he understood. The entity was not a creature with a form. It was the absence of form. It was the ultimate boundary, encompassing everything, yet containing nothing. A vast, shifting, consuming edge. It fed on order, on the very idea of things belonging. Every line, every corner, every definition was a meal. And his world, once so ordered, was a grand feast, dissolving into chaos. He felt its presence as an immense, cold hunger, a silent, all-consuming maw that was not just around him, but was the very space around him. The air, the walls, the light, all were part of its shifting form. He was trapped within its monstrous embrace, a tiny speck of order in an ocean of unbridled, multidimensional chaos. He was a piece of its art, a living fragment in its infinite, terrifying carrelage. Amidst the chaos, a single image formed in his mind, clear, perfect, untainted, his sister, her smile, her bright eyes, her hair, not a photograph, not a painting, just her pure memory. She was not framed, not by wood, not by glass, not by the edges of a canvas. She was free, a pure, unblemished memory existing outside the entity's grasp, a single, perfect truth. But even that perfect image began to waver. The edges of his memory, the borders of his thought, were not safe. The entity's hunger was absolute, consuming all that defied its chaotic reign. Her smile stretched, her form blurred, pulled into the swirling vortex of impossible colors. The last true image of her, consumed by the encroaching chaos. Gone forever. With her gone, the last anchor of his sanity snapped. His thoughts became a jumble of fractured images, impossible sounds, meaningless words. The frames of his mind shattered. He was no longer Elias. He was a collection of sensations, a fleeting glimpse of terror, a whisper of a memory. He was a piece of the collage, a content without a frame, yet trapped within the ultimate frame. He felt himself stretching, thinning, becoming a part of the vast, shifting tapestry of horrors. His essence, his very being, was being woven into the entity's monstrous, infinite collection. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were echoes, fragments of the entity's vast, alien consciousness swirling through his dissolving mind. He was a conduit, a vessel. His purpose, his identity, everything that made him him was being repurposed. He was becoming a border, a frame for something unspeakable. A silent, screaming piece of art. The terror was not in dying, but in never truly dying. In becoming a permanent, conscious fragment within the entity's infinite, ever-changing prison. The ultimate containment. The overwhelming hum began to recede, fading into a low, pervasive thrum that settled into the very fabric of existence. The assault was over. The consumption was complete. A chilling calm descended. The world was no longer a chaotic collage. It was something else, something new yet ancient, something that felt perfectly ordered in its own horrifying way. The framing entity had not left. It had simply absorbed. It had reframed. And it was still active, still hungry, its insidious work continuing, unseen, unheard by the unsuspecting. Our world, your world, is just another canvas, another collection of boundaries waiting to be breached, another series of contents waiting to be consumed and replaced. We cling to our frames, don't we? Our windows, our doors, the borders of our screens. We believe they hold reality in place, that they protect us from the chaos beyond. But what if those frames are not guardians? What if they are simply temporary illusions, holding back a tide of unimaginable horror for now? What if they are already shifting? Elias Thorne, the conservator of frames, learned this truth too late. His desperate need for order had become the entity's greatest tool, and now he was part of its collection. His screams, his terror, his very essence were now just another fragment within the entity's infinite collage, a silent testament to the fragility of order, the monstrousness of boundaries. The entity is not just in old houses or forgotten mirrors. It is in every boundary, every perceived separation. It is the silent, hungry architect of a world where nothing stays where it belongs. Look around you, at the screen you are watching this on, at the room you are sitting in, at the window that frames your view of the outside world. Do you feel safe? We build our lives on frames, on rules, on the idea of solid separation. But what if those frames are already compromised? What if the borders are already bleeding? The entity waits, patiently, silently, feeding on the very principle of containment, slowly transforming the familiar into a fragmented, reframed collage of pure, inescapable horror. Elias Thorne is gone, consumed, But the horror he faced, the truth he uncovered, still lingers. A cold dread that reminds us we are all just contents, waiting for our frames to fail. What would you do when the world itself becomes a frame and you are the picture? When the very concept of inside and outside ceases to exist? Because the entity is still out there, and it's looking for its next masterpiece. Keep watching your frames. You never know what might be looking back.